Louis has joined me today to talk about his book chapter titled Representing France's Syrian Colony Without a Flag, Imperial Cartographic Strategies at the Margin of the Peace Conference, in which he discusses French mapping practices in the Levant after World War I, offering a new perspective of the French imperial gaze on Syria, differing from that of the famous Sykes-Picot map. He does so by highlighting the reticular dimension of imperial cartographic spatialities. But before we delve into this interesting topic, I wanted to ask you to tell me a bit more about your own background and how it is you came to write a chapter for a book centered around the theme of connectivity.
Thank you, Michael. So this chapter is actually a part of a larger research that I'm completing now for my PhD dissertation. That is more generally on French cartographic practices in the Levant from the middle of the 19th century, 1860 to be precise, and that lasts until the middle of the Mandate period, so 1933 to be exact. And I'm looking at how these French and European in general cartographic practices had an impact on the production and the construction of these territories at this pivotal time that was the end of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the European mandates, and especially the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon. So in that regard, the question of connectivity is present in different manners. It links different points and different aspects of my research. First of all, of course, the question of connectivity links to the question of empire in general. Of course, the question of empire has been questioned from different angles by the literature in the last century, maybe. And the question of connectivity is a way to look at empire in a new manner, looking at all the different networks of empire and trying to deconstruct the maybe fusionist approach in a large sense, but also to try to see how empires were built on not only material and social networks, but also on imaginary networks. And that's how I came to work on the question of imaginaries of connectivity, which is the topic of the book. And I think how my research looked at this particular question is how cartography helps in developing and incarnating and representing these imaginaries of connectivity that in fact help promote and help construct in minds, but also in practice, empire. And the question of French empire and French imperial networks in the Levant is in that regard really interesting, because of course before in the 1920s it was an informal empire. There was no actual direct rule in the Levant, and cartography was a way, and that's what the chapter is about. Cartography was a way for French cartographers to picture and represent an informal empire and the shape to that empire that didn't actually exist in a direct manner.
So your work exists kind of at the intersection of where empire making through mapping meets imaginaries of connectivity, specifically in the French historical sphere?
Yes, sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat?
Yes, your work, it exists at the intersection between empire making through mapping and imaginaries of connectivity, would you say?
Yes, of course. And of course, I'm looking at this relationship between mapping and empire, and I'm trying to go maybe beyond the classical critical approach that has presented cartography as the perfect tool for conquest, administration, and study of imperial territories and population. And what the literature has found, and what I try to build upon, is that actually mapping and empire are the two sides of the same coin, and that's cartography is not only a tool of empire, but it's also empire that is a tool of cartography, and they were built together by statesmen and cartographers and implemented in metropolises and then in the empire. And that actually cartography, by creating these imaginaries of connectivity, because cartography puts different objects on the same paper and put different territories on the same page and picture them together, creates an imaginary of connectivity by putting together objects that are in reality far from each other, and it creates an impression of coherence and continuity where there is in fact fragmentation, and empire is fragmentation. We have thousands of kilometers between the metropolis and the colony. Cartography helps reduce this distance and this fragmentation by bringing together on the same map different territories.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're hinting at it, but I wanted to ask, because the key argument you make in your chapter is that this connection between mapping and empire must be viewed as a reticular process, and how this helps us understand the relationship between the two. Can you just shortly explain what you mean by these reticular processes?
Yes, of course. So empire, when I present empire as a reticular process, is the idea that I expressed earlier, that empire is built on networks of people and also on ideas of networks and the conscience of these networks. And the French Empire in the Levant is really a good illustration of that, because it was built on merchants, diplomats, proteges that the French consulates had in this region. And it was a network of people and of diplomats, merchants, and proteges that had a common knowledge and a common conscience of what they represented and of their link to France on the one part and to the Ottoman territory on the other. And at the same time, cartography in that respect was also reticular, in the sense that cartography was building on these same networks and on these same interests, economic but also social interests that France had in the Levant, and working on these different networks. And the fact that these two objects, empire and cartography, connect and build on each other in the region helps to understand how they are producing this idea of French Empire that helps in the end promote it in a very political and material kind of way.
And reticular in this case, then it refers to a kind of an almost web-like network that straddles all factors of France's influence in the Levant, right?
Yes, of course, of course. And cartography is at the center of this process, and that's something you can really see on the later period in the Mandate, because in the Mandate you have this reticular cartographic empire, because France implements in the Levant cartographic practices. It has developed and experimented in other colonial terrains. So, for instance, and not only for instance, but most of the cartographic practices it implements in the Mandate in the Levant were designed in North Africa. So you have this network of cartographers that were formed and trained in Algeria and especially in Morocco, which map was drawn at the same time as Syria, and so they were trained in Morocco and then sent to Syria and trained in Syria and then sent to Morocco and Algeria, but also in France and in the eastern part of France that was liberated from German occupation after the First World War. So you have this connection between empire and the metropolis, and these networks of empire that are visible and that are formed through cartography.
Exactly. Now, at some point you mentioned how the economic imperative progressively replaced the glory and the civilizing mission in legitimizing imperial expansion. Is this also how colonial expansion was sold to decision makers back home, back in France, or did they still rely on more normative arguments to drive home the need to invest in a colony?
The colonial movement, the colonial gesture towards the Levant, well, towards the rest of the world in general, but towards the Levant in particular, was of course embedded in this inheritance of the colonial glories of the past, and on especially on the idea that colonization was the expression of the expansion of the revolutionary and the Enlightenment inheritance. And so, especially for the Levant, the whole process of conquest was, of course, embedded in the memory of Napoleon's expedition in Egypt in 1798. And so, even when Napoleon III in 1860-1861 went to Syria with an expedition in force, and for that matter, a cartographic expedition, it was embedded in this memory of colonial glory and grandeur, and the mission, the civilizing mission. But it's true that after, especially after the First War, but already before that, at the beginning of the century, you have this feeling in France that the colonies are more becoming more a burden than an actual resource and an actual place where France can find glory and resources. And so, what is interesting is that the moment when Syria and Lebanon become part of the French Empire at the end of the war, is that pivotal moment in France when you have more arguments that are designed by the advocates of colonialism to promote this developmentalism, this idea that colonialism should not be only exploitation of resources, but should be a way to develop the colony as an entity in itself, and develop a link to this colony in an association spirit, in a way so that the colony is not a financial burden for the metropolis, but also for in the idea that the colony must, in the end, become grow as independent economy and country. And so in Syria, you have this pivotal turn between the idea that Syria is the chasse gardée of France, and Syria has this historical interest in France because it has to protect the Oriental Christians, and so you have this defense of this ancient, glorious past, French past in Syria, and you have also the people trying to find a way to defend France's interest in Syria by saying that Syria could provide interest to France. And then you have this third approach, developmental approach, promoting a more developmental project for Syria that is actually more in terms with the mandate spirit, which is finding a tutor, a guardian in the powers in that name France to help Syria and the other mandates develop and India become independent.
Understood. So the economic imperative, it was more like, oh, perhaps we're not making enough profits and able to find enough resources in this colony, so we need to find a new perspective on how we handle our abroad territories, or was it really a new focus on a different kind of exploitation of these lands?
So you have both discourses actually. You have those who, like we colonial members of the colonial party, of the traditional colonial party, trying to promote new ways to exploit old and new resources in Syria. And for instance, cotton was a big interest in Syria, and one of the reasons these members of the colonial party wanted to have Syria the biggest they could was to have access to the northern parts of Syria, which are now the southern part of Turkey and Cilicia, to find new territories to develop cotton growing and to be competitive in the international market of cotton. But at the same time, you also had the advocates of a more developmental approach, which promoted the idea of stopping this, let's say, cash crop colonial administration, and stop seeing this new colony as only a place where France could find new resources, but also trying to engage in this mandate spirit that France was the new guardian for Syria and had to help develop it as a full entity and as an autonomous in a territorial, geographical, economic, and also social and national kind of way, as an autonomous entity.
All right. So obviously, during the First World War and before, the Levant still belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And at some point, you shared the statistic that over 60% of foreign investments in the Ottoman Empire came from France. I was wondering, to what extent was the Ottoman Empire aware of France's growing influence in the Levant, and did it show resistance, or was it a necessary evil for this already dwindling empire that could use all the monetary assets it could get? It was labeled the sick man of Europe, after all.
Of course, so the influence of France, but not only France, also of course Germany, and England, of course, were really influential in this period, and had also all kinds of different material, commercial, etc. interests in the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire was, of course, really aware of this influence and really trying to make its way with it. And the problem is that you had always this tension as the more the structure of the states, of course I say state, but you had different sultans, different ministers in different periods, and you didn't have the same resistance and the same movements between the late 1860s and the 1910s. But you have always the tension in that period between the Tanzimat period and the beginning of the Tanzimat period in the 1860s until the Great War, the tension between fighting the influence, but also a way to fight the influence was to modernize. And by modernizing and adapting reforms, the Ottoman Empire also adapted and integrated all kinds of Western norms and reforms. So also by fighting and resisting the influence, the Ottoman Empire was more and more westernized. So it was really in this tension that you can understand the relation between the two. And also the empire was trying to reassert its imperial power on its territory, and mainly Syria, but also in Libya, in the Hejaz, in different parts of the Arab province of the empire. And by asserting its imperial power, it was also designing new ways and influenced by European imperialism as well. So it was also influenced by this, let's say, Western approach to empire administration.
I see. Yet it seems that knowing what happened after, obviously, France and England split up the mandate, and the Ottoman Empire kind of crumbled, that despite being able to look at Western powers and the way they handled the empire, they could do nothing but sit idly and watch as slowly the influence from the Western powers grew in the Levant. Would you say that's the case?
No, actually, no. They were trying to not resist, but to adapt and to modernize, and that's the whole period of modernization of the empire. And actually, it's really interesting because cartography was one of the themes and one of the fields where the Ottoman Empire, where you can see this tension between modernization and let's say crumble or collapse, because cartography. So the Ottoman Empire had its own cartographic tradition, I think, inherited from the modern era, etc. But then during the 19th century, at the period of all the reform of the Ottoman state and of the growing influence of European cartographers, especially in Anatolia and Syria, you had this feeling that a more state-run, scientific, modern cartography, arithmetic cartography was needed to complete the reform of the state, to implement cadastral surveys, etc., etc. So what did the Ottomans do? They actually signed agreements with European general staff and European cartographic agencies to have some Ottoman officers be trained in European cartographic services. So you have these Ottoman cartographers that are formed by the Prussian military and then by the French military in Paris that go back to Istanbul and put in place a central Ottoman cartographic service and implement this kind of modern cartography that is actually totally influenced and copycat on the French system.
Okay, all right. I've run out of questions, so Louis, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully until some next time.